Grover. Have a seat. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Steve Clemens. I run the what's called the American Strategy Program here at the New America Foundation. Oftentimes, we named ourselves the American Strategy Program so that we could basically talk about whatever we wanted and whatever policy. It was my focus on, eventually imperial creep inside the New America Foundation, and in particular, I often talk about foreign policy, national security issues, but today I want to just talk about politics and policy. I have got the pleasure today to introduce someone you all know, Grover Norquist, who's president of Americans for Tax Reform. And anyone who I've known for a long period of time knows that I have long sought out friends, allies, people to wrestle with, think about intellectual problems and challenges with. And I've had the pleasure and privilege of knowing Grover for a long time and working with him. And I often feel, particularly with my liberal and progressive friends, that often aren't on the same page with Grover, that there is an unfortunate habit in Washington where we don't talk across lines, and we also don't realize within our various camps that there are lots of other factions and tensions, fault lines going on, and that if we did sort of look at the fault lines and tensions and factions in the Republican camp or the Democratic camp, or even among independents where I comfortably reside, that there's a lot of opportunity for thinking through in more pragmatic ways some of these challenges. And Grover has written a very new book that I'm very pleased to say is very un-Ann Coulter-like. And I say that as Ann Coulter, who is not one of my favorite people, engages in rants. Grover Norquist's new book, Leave Us Alone, Getting the Government's Hands Off Our Money, Our Guns, Our Lives. Great title, but when you read this, which I have, it is analytical, and it is thoughtful, and it is trying to put on the table ways in which to look at the challenges facing the nation in various ways. So I am not, I'm quite pleased and enthused to be working with Grover Norquist, who is, of course, I've gone to the various meetings, the famous Wednesday meetings that he has. I haven't been banned yet, in which he does, I think he basically talks, make sure that everybody believes in Christmas and has a gun. I don't have a gun, and I'm cool with Christmas, but I'm cool with other stuff too, and I know he is well. But Grover Norquist and his wife Sama are very, very good friends. We also work a lot, and I just want to acknowledge my friend Paul Saunders here of the Nixon Center, because while I'm not on the board of the Nixon Center and Grover is, we work and hang out with a lot. There are a lot of different lines in this room that we're pleased to do, and I want to thank Grover for his support of many of the things that I've been doing, and plus on the blog. And also the last bit I'll add, I got a scoop on Condi Rice speaking before the Wednesday meeting. And I'm despite Dan Sr. and others going out there and sort of adding to it, nonetheless, I broke the news and story about the possibility that Condi Rice was positioning herself as a potential, not necessarily likely, but potential vice presidential running mate with John McCain. And to my knowledge, Grover has not yet shut me down or off for leaking what was going on with this, in which he didn't have anything to do with it. But I wanted to thank him for letting me do my job, which is to try to figure out if I'm not in the room, my attitude is I don't have to be subject to the off-the-record rules. And I wasn't in the room at that point. So thanks very much. Please give a hand to Grover Norquist, and let's discuss his book.
Thank you, Steve. The book "Leave Us Alone," as advertised, is not a rant or a list of things the world ought to do because it would please me, and why don't they hurry up and get cracking? It's an analysis. It's in three parts. The first part of the book looks at the two competing coalitions in American politics and how they're structured, and therefore what they can do. And for those who want to think about foreign policy questions in the question-answer period, take a look at what the two parties, how they're structured and what they can and can't do. It tells you what they can do on foreign policy as well. The center-right coalition, the coalition that I work with that is represented in the Wednesday meeting that Steve talked about, if you want to know why Republicans, conservatives, Reagan Republicans do what they do, why they show up to vote, why they show up to be active, if they're around in a circle, everybody's in because on their vote-moving issue, what they want from the government is to be left alone. So you go around the circle. Taxpayers, don't raise my taxes. Businessmen and women, leave my business and my self-employment alone. There are businesses who want subsidies or want the government to kneecap their competitor. They play for the other team. But around the table, if you just want to be left alone, if you're not asking for anything from the government and you're voting on that issue, you're in. I'm on the board of the National Rifle Association. We're meeting this weekend in Kentucky. We'll have 60,000 folks there. Again, the people who vote on the Second Amendment, who vote on the gun issue, what they want from the government is to be left alone. They don't want gun stamps. They don't want. They don't go knocking on your door, telling you to be a hunter. The homeschooler movement, people who want to educate their own children. Again, they don't ask for approbation from the state. They want to be left alone. And the one that people tend to misunderstand is the traditional values, conservatives, social conservatives, religious right. If you want to know what moves their vote, not what moves some people's mouths, but what moves their vote, it's a parents' rights movement. They want to practice their faith, raise their kids, and be left alone to do that. You can get some of the leaders who make outrageous statements on behalf of others, but if you want to know what moves actual votes and how it came into being, and part of the book goes into how the religious right got organized, not after prayer was banned from public schools, not after Roe v. Wade, but in the late 70s when it was believed that the Carter administration was going after Christian radio stations through the FCC and the Fairness Doctrine in Christian schools to take away their tax-deductible status. And that's when all of the organizations got structured and people popped up as a self-defense effort. So around the table, how you have all these people, and you can say, well, the New York Times commented in the 1980s, or 1980 when Reagan was running, they said, gee, you got all these guys who go to church and all these guys who have jobs, and they'll be fighting any moment now, which missed a couple of things. One, the guy who goes to church doesn't irritate the guy who has a job. They don't necessarily see each other. And some people have jobs and go to church. And the coalition is actually held and deepened and strengthened rather than shattered or been some sort of fault line, which outsiders and some of the guys on the right keep expecting to happen someday. And the reason is we have our meeting in D.C., and there are 45 state capital versions of that meeting, from Tallahassee to Austin to Boston. Around the table, the guy who is in, and he's voting for the Republican because he wants his money left alone, he wants to make money all day, looks across the table at the guy who wants to go to church all day, looks across the table at the guy who wants to fondle his guns all day, and each one of them says, that's not how I'd spend my time. But it's not necessary that they all agree how they spend their time. It's just necessary they vote for the same candidate. And the Republican candidate stands in the middle and says, I'm going to leave your guns alone, your kids alone, your faith alone, your business alone, your money alone, your 401k alone, and then we're done. And he has the votes. But that's why it's a low-maintenance coalition and why it's held. People, you can argue, but if you ask the guys 20 questions, as Pat Buchanan did, I ask him 20 questions, and I find that 70% of people are not happy with free trade with China. And I know, as a member of the board of the National Rifle Association, that many people who vote on the gun issue have what I consider the oddest views on free trade with China. They don't vote on that issue. So at one level, I don't care, and it's not important politically. I mean, I suppose I care in theory, but it's not important in terms of how people vote. And Pat Buchanan discovered that 70% of people were skeptics on free trade, and 70% of people thought there were too many immigrants, and he got 1% of the vote. Because he didn't ask the second question, which is, and what issue are you voting on? And the answer was not the one you just asked me about. And so part of what I talk about in the book is the importance for people who care about politics of understanding the difference between intensity and preference. The American people are very polite, and if you ask them 20 questions, if they have the time, they'll give you all 20 answers. That doesn't mean they vote on those 20 questions. There are a lot of issues that people will, Speaker Gingrich has a list of 80-20 issues that he's been talking about as a possible agenda for the right. My view is most of 80-20 issues are kind of by definition not vote-moving issues, or one party would be crushing the other 80-20. What you know about an 80-20 issue is it hasn't been framed as a vote-moving issue yet. I mean, you could possibly reframe it in a way that where it did move votes. It was not moving votes now. or somebody would be crushing the other team, and the country's a lot closer to 50-50 than 80-20. The Democratic Party, the left, Hillary Clinton made a comment in upstate New York a number of years ago that what we need is one of these progressives need a meeting like Grover has in D.C. And I got a call from the New York Press saying, what do you think of that? And I explained our coalition, why it's a low-maintenance coalition, why it works. I said, Hillary and the Democrats can't quite do the same thing. Who would sit around the left's table? Who shows up? Trial lawyers, labor unions, big city political machines, the two wings of the dependency movement, the guys who are locked into welfare dependency, the guys who make $90,000 a year, managing the dependency of others, making sure they don't get jobs and become Republicans, and then all the various, what I would call the coercive utopians, the guys who get government grants to fix the rest of us and make us better people through the power of the state. These are the people who make the cars too small to put entire families into, the toilets too small to completely flush, and they have a series of rules that the rest of us should organize ourselves around. They want government grants to enforce these. Their list of rules is slightly longer and more tedious than Leviticus. But again, it's not voluntary. They want the government to enforce it. So around Hillary's table on the left, this is why Hillary and Obama can't do anything on free trade, because the unions have a veto. They can't do anything that irritates the trial lawyers. They're hedged in because these parts of the Democratic coalition are so key. The modern Democratic Party is talking about blowing up NAFTA, never mind moving forward to Doha. So they're just certain things that the Republican Party can't turn around and steal people's guns. They can't turn around and raise taxes. That just isn't an option. The Democratic Party can't do things that organized labor and the trial lawyers will not allow. Around Hillary's table, they can get along and work together as long as there's more money coming in the table. If the Republicans are stupid enough to raise taxes and throw more money in the center of the table, then they can get along sort of like the scene in the movie after the bank robbery, where they one for you, one for you, one for you, and the various interested parties can each be happy. But if we do our job right, and I run Americans for Tax Reform, we ask people to take the pledge not to raise taxes. Stephen Colbert took it last night on television. So we're really wrapping things up here. But I got about 97% of all the Republicans running at the national level who've taken the pledge and have kept it. About a third of the Republicans at the state level in those states like California, I have everybody but one in the state legislators taking the pledge. And they just hold the line, not raising taxes. Can't do it. Where that's happened, the Republicans have done well. Digression from the discussion of the Takings Coalition, but there hasn't been a tax increase enacted in Washington, D.C. since 1993 when Clinton had the House, Senate, and he raised taxes in 93. Not a tax increase during that 15-year period. That is the longest period in American history without a tax increase out of Washington, going back to Jefferson and Washington and Adams, the guy in between. So that's a fairly important change, and it walks through what the Republicans can and will not do. On the Democratic side, if we say no new taxes, hold that line, don't allow spending to increase, and this administration's greatest failure is, but it has allowed spending to increase. They've had 15 tax cuts in the last 8 years. As a result, taxes are now $577 billion more this year in tax revenue than when Clinton walked out the door. So revenue's higher, just as the supply-siders said it would be if you reduced marginal tax rates. However, they've increased spending by about $870 billion a year, so about $300 billion a year, higher growth of spending than tax revenue increased. If we were to stop the flow of resources in, then around Hillary's table you have a challenge, and the challenge there is that everybody, as there's less and less money in the middle of the table, everybody begins to look at each other a little bit more like the second to the last scene in those lifeboat movies, where they're trying to decide who to eat and who to throw overboard. Because if there's not enough for everybody, they'll cheerfully gnaw on the guy next to him if we don't feed him taxpayers. So those are the two coalitions. And I argue in the book there are two other groups. There are legacy voters, the little old ladies in Maine who agree with George McGovern on everything and vote for the Republicans because the guy at Little Round Top was a Republican. And there are little old ladies in Mississippi who agree with Ronald Reagan on everything and vote for George McGovern because Sherman was mean to Atlanta recently. But the legacy voters, guys, Irish-American businessmen in Boston who are voting Democrats because the guy who was mean to their great-great-grandfather when he showed up in Boston was a Protestant Republican, and so they vote Democrat. Over time, the two parties tend to go after legacy voters, and when things happen, say, I know you always voted for the other party because of something happened 100 years ago, but you might want to be open to switching and voting on today's issues. And that's what happened during the lifetime of Ronald Reagan, where a lot of the legacy voters in the South and the North switched over, and the two parties divided out into more ideological, or as I said, the guys who vote on issues where they want to be left alone, and the people who vote on issues where they want the government to go take something from other people and give it to them. I don't see those two coalitions shifting. I don't see them changing. I see some individuals shifting from one side to the other. We've had a series of exogenous shocks in the system in the last several years with Iraq and foreign policy and who switched parties. And there hasn't been, the two coalitions hold together. I mean, people move back and forth somewhat, but the structures of the two parties have not changed, and I don't think will change over the next 25 years. The center of the book is 40 trends on what's going to happen over the next 25 years. The biggest trend in the last 25 years was the growth of not the number of people whose parents speak Spanish. The biggest shift in the last 25 years is, in fact, the number of Americans who own shares of stock directly. When Reagan was elected, 20% of Americans owned stock in 401ks, IRAs, mutual funds. Today it's over 60% of adults. Scott Rasmussen has some wonderful polling data that I cite in Leave Us Alone, which points out that if you own $5,000 or more of stock, it makes you 18% more Republican and less Democrat. And this is true for all demographic groups, all age groups, men, women, employed, unemployed. More share ownership makes you more Republican. Same thing is true on the flip side with have a government job. You have a government job, it makes you 10% more Democrat, less Republican. Hold that job 30 years, make more than $75,000 a year, and it becomes about 20 or 30% more Democrat as people realize that there aren't jobs with those kind of requirements and that kind of pay in the real world. And it makes people go out and put Democratic precinct worker signs on their front lawns. Looking at the other trends, there's a decline in the number of hunters, traditionally the backbone of the Second Amendment community. Each generation, at least in the last two, only about 2/3 of the people whose parents are hunters themselves. A number of reasons for that, including it's not as easy to go find a place to go shoot as it used to be. On the other hand, the number of people with concealed carry permits, those of you who are from Virginia are familiar with the more liberal concealed carry laws that now exist in 36 states. If you're 21, reasonably sane, and haven't been in prison recently, you can get a permit and carry a gun concealed. There are now several million Americans with that, and I believe that's the backbone of the Second Amendment voting community over the next 25 years as those numbers continue to increase. Hunters, keep a gun in the closet and once a year go out and irritate Bambi's relatives. People with concealed carry permits carry a gun in their car around their person each day, and that you're never going to get those away from them. Those are guys who are voting on the Second Amendment much more than the hunting community. You go through some of the demographics. 25, 10, 20 years from now, they're going to be more Mormons who tend to be Republican, more Orthodox Jews who tend to be Republican. The wonderful numbers from Arthur Brooks that 100 liberals chosen at random, 100 conservatives chosen at random. The 100 conservatives have 42 more children than the 100 liberals, and that number has increased over the last 30 years and continues to increase. So some of the demographics look along those lines. Then add to that overlay. Last year, 4 million people were born. 1 million of those were Hispanic. The Republican Party has got to learn how to discuss all issues, including immigration, in a way that says to Hispanic voters, we would like you to be voting with us. George Bush did that fairly well. McCain got 72% of the Hispanic vote in Arizona, which is a state where immigration is a very significant issue, and he does well both with non-Hispanic voters, Anglo voters, and with Hispanic voters. Florida, Texas, are states where the Republican Party has done better in reaching out to Hispanic votes, California less so. And that's the question. The Republican Party and individual candidates have to decide where that vote is going to go over time. So, and then the third part of the book is sort of where we go from here on taxes and spending and some of the issues. I passed out on people's chairs sort of the biggest change since the book was written. I have a chapter towards the end in Leave Us Alone on the transparency movement, because one of the questions is spend too much. We've done fairly well, Republicans, on locking down tax increases. Not a tax increase in Washington, 15 years. Not bad for a start. 15 tax cuts in the last 8 years. Some of those temporary, some of them fairly small, but still all moving in the right direction. Minor problem with spend too much. Big problem with spend too much. How'd that happen? And again, it gets back to the question, when you wonder why people do things, think back to the structures of the two competing coalitions. George Bush stood in the middle of the center-right coalition and he said, I'm going to leave your guns alone and spend too much. I'm going to leave your money alone and spend too much. I'm going to leave your property alone, spend too much. I'm going to leave your business alone, spend too much. I'm going to leave your family, faith, your kids alone, and I'm going to spend too much. And everybody said, thank you for my vote moving, and your guns alone, spend too much. Thank you very much for my vote moving issue, and grumble, grumble, I wish you wouldn't spend too much. Okay? Spend too much is not a deal breaker. It doesn't make people walk out of the room. It doesn't make people throw heavy objects. Had the president walked in the room and said, I'm raising taxes, people would have left the room. If he said, I'm going to start stealing people's guns, it would have broken the coalition. Spend too much was not and has not been a deal breaker. It's the thing that and you can sort of buy peace in other zones with spend too much, not from your own constituents, but from guys who might otherwise be whacking at you. And that explains why, even though if you ask Republicans or conservatives, what do you want? They say, we want limited government. What slides? The aggregate question of whether government is limited. How do you fix that? I get asked sometimes, could we take a pledge, a no spending pledge like the no tax pledge? What'd you do? Pick a number, a percentage? I mean, it's not a binary question the way tax increases or not tax increases, or you either raise taxes or you didn't on Tuesday. Spend too much. I mean, the way they structure things in D.C., nobody votes for the whole budget. Everybody can look you in the eye and tell you they were against a quarter of what was in the budget, and they're all kind of telling the truth. Everybody touched the ball, nobody touched it last, and yet it keeps getting out of bounds. So on the spending issue, I do see an opportunity to turn spending into a vote-moving issue, total aggregate spending, and the model is what's happened with earmarks. The transparency movement, which is just in the last year and a half, I was calling around 2 Novembers ago and talking to Republican governors saying, what are you doing? How can we help? What do you got that I could share with other people? Governor Rick Perry of Texas said, well, I just posted all of my government spending as a governor up on the web so everybody can see that I buy Time Magazine and what I had for lunch yesterday and how much I pay my secretary and what the furniture cost and all expenses of the governor's office. And the lady comptroller, Susan Combs, did the same thing for the entire state budget. So I started going to other governors. The governor of Missouri did it by executive order. The governor of South Carolina posted every check and expenditure by executive order. The governor of Alaska did the same thing by executive order. Kansas, Oklahoma passed laws to that effect. We now have another 7 states that have passed laws or done executive orders. The websites that I just mentioned, those are all up and listed on the sheet. The other 7 are not up. The list I gave you, and it's on our website, atr.org, under the transparency button, is already old. Georgia governor 2 days ago signed transparency legislation that was passed. Arizona will have it on the ballot this November, and I believe that Schwarzenegger will do it by executive order shortly.
Any Dem governors?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I want to get to this. This is a nonpartisan effort. Ralph Nader joined me in sending a letter to every governor urging them to do this. Washington State, which has a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic governor, passed it unanimously in both houses. The governor signed it. The bill was written by their right-wing state think tank. If you want some idea of, honest liberals, honest conservative, honest good government types, people who aren't necessarily honest or good government but don't wish to appear so, all feel move this forward. The only problem we've had is the Republican governor of South Dakota vetoed it, and we almost overrode his veto with both Republican and Democrat support. I'm not in South Dakota. I'm told that he's been having an argument trying to hide the pay of his political appointees over the last several years and thought that this was an effort to get at that. This is an effort to get at the entire budget. So Indiana, the governor posts every contract up on the web as soon as it's done. It is my hope that both Coburn and Obama will reintroduce the weak legislation that they passed in '06, which says we'll have a summary of contracts and grants up on the web, better than we've ever had, and fairly weak. It's like the little blotchy thing you see on Google Earth when they're trying to hide what's going on. You know there's something there, right? We have a contract to mow the lawn at the Pentagon, $4 million. Once a week, once a month. How do you bid against that contract to get the monopoly rents out of it if you don't know what's actually in the contract? You have to see actual wording of the contract, of the grant, to see whether somebody's walking away with the cash. I think at the federal level and the state level in the next 10 years, this is inevitable. People are used to going online and seeing their Amex accounts. They're used to checking their UPS and FedEx material traveling across the country. They can see every check they write at their bank. They're going to start expecting this at the state level. And now that it's online in a number of states, you know, the new states, the old states originally said, oh, we can't do this, it costs $jillions of dollars. Oh, really? I mean, it's been tens of thousands of dollars because all of this stuff is already online. The just question is opening it up to looking at it and sticking a Google search engine on top of it. Think about what this will do for local government. 60 school districts in Texas post their actual check registers. I think that the school board elections in those school districts are going to be much more interesting in 2, 4, and 6 years, because instead of standing outside the school and saying the kids dress funny and they talk in slang and they don't pray enough, you can say, here are the 25 checks the school board wrote last year that would not have been written if I'd been on the school board. And all of a sudden, you've handed $1 million in opposition research to everybody who wants to run for sheriff in the country, everybody who wants to run for mayor. Think about the people that you know and perhaps yourself. You don't feel comfortable going into somebody else's territory because you don't know enough to know what you don't know. With fiscal transparency of your local government, your county government, your city government, your town government, special taxing authorities, you can quickly find that you or somebody that you know could know as much as the guys who are running things right now. So I think this is going to bring a much more vibrant democracy and much more serious public control of local government. So with that said, I haven't talked about foreign policy. I know a lot of people here are interested in it, but think through the two coalitions, and when you ask the government to do something, Bush announced after the 2004 election, I got 55 senators, I'll now personalize, privatize Social Security. And I had a conversation with the smartest people at the White House, and I said, no, you won't. Take 60 votes to beat a filibuster. The Democrats will filibuster. Oh, no, there are 8 or 9 that might be willing. I said, no, they're not. I said, think about the Democratic Party coalition. You turn every American into somebody who saves 10% of his or her income in a 401k all their life, and the party of trial lawyers, labor unions, and big city political machines is dead. It's over. There'll be 2 parties. They'll reconstitute, but there is not room for a trial lawyer, labor union, big city political party in a world where every American has a 401k that saves 10% of his income, and they actually have real life savings over the course of their life. Therefore, and that's exactly what happened. They didn't get any votes. They weren't going to get any. It wasn't Bush's fault. He didn't kill Social Security reform, but it was stillborn. I mean, he was out there for 5 months carrying Social Security around like a weekend at Bernie's, going, oh, it's alive, look, it's moving, and he'd poke it, and said, no, it wasn't. It was dead. It was not going anywhere because the Democratic Party could not allow that, could not allow it to happen. Unless you have 60 votes, wasn't going to happen. Sometimes you can't ask some of these coalitions to do certain things, and that's one of the things you cannot ask them to do. There's that wonderful scene in Hannibal Lecter's Silence of the Lambs, where Hannibal Lecter talks the guy in the next cell into swallowing his tongue and killing himself. And I explained to Karl Rove he wasn't that good. They couldn't do that. They couldn't get the Democratic Party to commit political suicide. That wasn't an option. They spent 6 months, 5 months, trying to talk the Democrats into doing it. It wasn't going to happen. And so some of the challenges we have when you look at gridlock, if you understand the structures of the two parties, you understand why one party or the other can't do certain things. Thoughts, arguments?
Great. Thank you very much, Grover. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Did Karl Rove call you back and say, hey, you were right?
Never. Not on that or anything else, by the way.
I have so many questions, and I'm not going to ask them all, but I am going to open up in an area that you didn't go in, because I know you struggle with it, but to some degree, when you think about the era we've been in, which a Republican has essentially set the terms of trade for much of the world, including the nation, for the last 8 years. And when you look at it collectively, the impact has been a government that has at least put its hands on money and guns. Or I mean money and, well, you could argue guns, but money and lives. And I'm thinking of sort of, the concern in much of your sort of crowd of kind of Big Brother Orwellian intrusions into private lives, which I think is a very, very big current that I've noticed in the Wednesday meeting group, and also the sense that whether or not taxes are not going up, those at the public trough, the lack of competition for things like the defense contracting, Halliburton, these really resonate in your group. So how angry, I mean, what's the level of anger in your community for that? What kinds of dynamics are at play, and what do you do with it now that you see, who the nominee will be? I see Bob Barr, I think, has announced or is about to announce as part of the Wednesday meeting, and I don't think Bob Barr thinks he's going to be president, but what's that about? And I assume it's about something having to do with the question I just posed.
Yeah, Bob Barr will be running, is running for the Libertarian Party nomination, and if he gets it, could get several percentage points and might be a bigger challenge to the Republican candidate this time around than Ralph Nader has been in the past. And he would be running as a skeptic of the occupation of Iraq and a skeptic of some of the things that the administration has done to accumulate power in the executive branch. I mean, one of the challenges you've had is that Cheney in the White House has been accumulating, for the entire presidency, has been accumulating power into the White House, and I think he's having one of these flashbacks to when he was in the White House with Ford, and he saw the White House and the executive branch collapsing and the Soviet Union surrounding the nation on all sides, and the Democratic Congress kicking him in the shins, and said, never let Congress know anything, see anything, or have any power. They're the other team, and accumulate all power in the presidency, because Republicans can win the presidency but can never win Congress. I think in the next 50 years, the Republicans will have Congress more than they have the presidency. And it was interesting to see, even though this administration came in with a Republican House and Senate for all but a year and a half of their first 6 years, when the Democrats had the Senate for a year and a half, they still kept shoving all the nuts and stuff and collecting them all into the White House and the executive branch. And you do see a number of Republicans writing about the danger that I mean, first of all, it's a bad idea, period. It's also politically unwise. It's worse than a crime. It's a blunder. It's politically unwise as well.
Yes, Chris Hayes.
I just wanted to follow up a little bit on that, because it strikes me as, I thought the analysis of coalitions is interesting, but it strikes me as two things I wanted you to comment. One, in terms of talking about businesses that want to be left alone and don't want the government to kneecap their opponents, sounds sort of abstractly, I guess, nice. But the fact of the matter is, the entire defense contracting industry is giving money to Republicans, supports Republicans. The entire tremendous growth of DHS and the tremendous degree to which it's privatized. I mean, this is all just monopoly rent seekers who are just getting monopoly rents out of the government, all giving money to Republicans. It's a massive part of what has become the Republican architecture. People literally dependent on non-competitive government contracts that they get because they're politically connected. That's now a central part of the funding mechanisms of the Republican coalition, or at least a growing part. So that's one thing I want you to comment on. The other is, why aren't there any African Americans in the Republican coalition? It seems to me that based on your analysis, you have to have some I'd like to hear you expound on that in terms of what your conclusions are about that.
Sure. Two very good questions. I would argue that Republicans are learning that people who contribute money because they get government contracts or grants or earmarks are in fact not part of the Leave Us Alone coalition. They are part of the people who show up outside the periphery of the state and will pay for favors regardless of who's in power. And to the extent that the Republicans have gone from raising their money from the Leave Us Alone coalition that was with you on principle and will be with you regardless, and said, oh, it's easier to get $1,000 contributions from some guy who wants a government contract or a grant. Among the many reasons why earmarks are a bad idea is they're thoroughly corrupting. Now, Democrats don't have souls, so it's not a problem, but for them. However, on the Republican side, it is particularly corrupting because when you're in D.C. Saying, oh, I can have a fundraiser and people give me thousands of dollars and all I have to do is vote for stupid spending programs and have earmarks. You know what you're not doing? You're not in your district talking to people who actually are part of your coalition and will be voting for you. You're actually raising money from people who hate you and won't vote for you, but transactionally they give you money because then you vote money for their things. And if you, and again, there's the old joke that there are three political parties in D.C., the Republicans, the Democrats, and the appropriators. And that was one of the things that Bush didn't understand. He would hand the ball off to a guy with an R jersey and forget and not notice that under that was an A for appropriator, and they'd run the other way. The appropriators are a third force in this town, and you can't expect, when people say, they used to say, oh yeah, we have a Republican majority, but not a conservative majority to explain why certain things couldn't pass, even with the Republican House and Senate. And that was true, but as the two parties have sorted themselves out, almost all conservatives are Republicans and almost all lefties are Democrats. What you need is a majority of Republican conservatives and to be a majority, and the appropriators don't count in counting towards that majority. You saw this with Lewis. In the middle of 2006, going into a tough election, Lewis is breaking with the party on budget votes because he wants to be able to take more money for the appropriators. I mean, complete treason, you know, if you looked at Lewis and saw Republican. Completely understandable if you looked at Lewis and saw appropriator. And one of the challenges is the guys who wear our jersey are not playing for our team. And that is a very real challenge, and it is bad politically, but the cheerful news of losing the majority is that those people who were giving you money, who hated you but wanted you, were trying to buy favors, aren't with you anymore. And so you better go out quickly, and the Republicans obviously are not doing that as rapidly as they need to, get out into the field and make a list of everybody that a 55% top marginal tax rate might damage and talk to them about contributing to their campaign. You asked, why don't we do better with the African-American vote? I skipped something in my earlier presentation. I said there are two groups that fall outside the Leave Us Alone versus the Takings Coalition. One are legacy voters, people who are, you talk to them, they sound irrationally, they're voting for one team or the other, but they're voting from the echoes of 100 years ago, or 50 years ago. And the other are gypsies. When I was in northern Romania, which some of the people up there thought of as southern Hungary, after the communists fell, we were having an election, and I was doing political training for the non-communists, and I made a list on the blackboard. I said, okay, guys.
You were doing political training in Romania?
Yeah, for the good guys, against the communists. They had a snap election. The communists had all these snap elections, and they tended to do pretty well in the snap elections because they had like all the cars and the TV sets.
Something about you I didn't know.
Yeah, well, it was fun. So I'm up there in a room just this big in a little school. So, okay, who's on our team? We made a list of all the people that are voting for us. I said, who's, the Protestants will be voting for us. Well, how many Protestant churches? Well, there are 3, okay, and you'll talk to one, and you'll talk to one, and we went down the list. So who's on the other team? And they said, well, the police and the army. On our team were the former prisoners of, former political prisoner association. how'd you like to live in a country that has an association of former political prisoners? So I said, okay, well, do they meet? Or
We
how do
may
we
be
meet?
getting that here in this country.
There were the returnees, the guys who'd gone to Russia and spent 30 years working there before they were allowed back in to Romania. But there were two groups that I didn't understand, that were listed on the communist side. I said one was waiters and the other were gypsies. I said, no, don't waiters work for tips? I mean, can we talk to them? And they explained the waiters are all secret police. They walk around and listen to people. Said, okay, we're not getting the waiters under those. What about the gypsies? If I understand gypsies, they're kind of outside the law, and I would rather be a gypsy outside soft-edged American law than harder-edged commie law. Couldn't we talk to them? No, this communists buy them liquor and get their votes. I said, we can do that. George Washington did that. We can play. And they said, no, the gypsies are scum, and we won't talk to them. Okay, then you're probably not getting their vote. And there are, unfortunately, in the United States, gypsy voters. And the African-American community is one where the Republican Party has not been out talking to them and asking. Tom Tancredo has been working very hard to make the Hispanic vote similarly structured. If people want to deport your mother, people get this odd view that you don't like them. Some of the smart restrictionists or deportationists say, well, no, 3 out of all 4 Hispanics are in the country legally. They won't care if you deport the 4th one, who's their relative, or their neighbor, or their friend, or or a spouse. When you scare the 1 out of 4, you irritate the 3 out of 4. And the gypsies are the people. You want to keep gypsies down to adult war. You want to keep that down as low as possible. Now, Democrats go around and have turned evangelical Protestants into gypsies and Mass-attending Catholics into gypsies. So, I mean, the D's have been equally goofy in some of this stuff as well, luckily. Or the Republicans wouldn't be standing. But the Republicans need to you need to get gypsies down to adult war, and they have. The Republicans did this with the Roman Catholic vote for 100 years, Romanism and rebellion. That was 1884, I think, a minister named Blanchard. I always thought that speech was given in a cave somewhere by Pat Robertson's great-great-grandfather, right? And the Democrats cheated by claiming that some irrelevant guy. He gave that speech at the RNC Religious Bureau, at the Republican National Committee of Religion. You can imagine how many Catholics and Jews were sitting in that room when that comment was made. The Democrats were Romanism and rebellion, equating Roman Catholicism with treason and alcohol. That's why we lose some votes, and you want to keep that down.
That's good. I want to go to Jim Pinkerton next, but I want to just
asked a tough question.
briefly ask you a silly but probing question. If you were to have an out-of-body experience looking down at Grover Norquist and his machine, would you say that you have that because it sounds like you're having to fight a lot of other Republicans too for what the next Republicanism is? Would you say that your dominance in the Republican franchise or your portion of the Republican franchise is greater today than in say 2000? Is your franchising group growing in influence, sort of holding its ground, or declining given other currents in the party?
Well, I think it's a different zone with different challenges. I think we dodged a bullet with the McCain nomination. We are not going to the leader of the party is McCain, not Tancredo, or Tancredo light. That was a huge step forward for those of us who want an inclusive majoritarian party. So I think that's extremely helpful. I think we largely dodged the Buchananite protectionist impulse. It was not impossible for the Republican Party to have veered into protectionism under some pressures. I mean, remember how many steps backward we took during the Reagan years. We've done much better than that on that. I think the growth of the investor class, the 60% of Americans with shares of stock. I mean, when we cut taxes in 2003, stock market went up to this day $5.5 trillion in value. $5.5 trillion. You take the cap gains rate back from 15 up to 20 or 25, 28 as Obama wants. You take the 15% tax on dividends up to 35% or 55% as Obama wants, and you see at least $5.5 trillion in people's 401ks disappear. That makes for a much more cohesive modern Republican Party and a sales pitch to the independent movement. So
that's your space.
Yeah, I think the steps backwards have been concerns that in Iraq you've gone from, I mean, there are two governmental parts of the Leave Us Alone coalition, cops and the Army. Okay, that's why the Republicans win when crime is an issue or when threats to the United States are an issue, because those are the two parts of the government that Republicans say, we ought to have cops to keep people from stealing your lawnmower, and we need an army to keep the Canadians off our back. And so those, now, when you go from that in a case like Vietnam or Iraq, and then portions of the population go, wait a minute, you've gone from Leave Us Alone to empire or something that's not Leave Us Alone. That's not part of leaving us alone. And when the president has gone into, oh, we're overdoing, we're over nation building, not, when you get away from we're over there because we have to defend the country and we're nation building, then you lose some of your argument.
Jim?
Gotcha. Grover, there have been two important developments on the issue of climate change in the last couple of days. First of all, Senator McCain announced support for legislation that is similar to the Warner-Lieberman bill, which the Congressional Budget Office scored as a $1.2 trillion with a T tax increase. And then second, the Bush administration listed the polar bear as endangered. Could you tell us what the Leave Us Alone coalition feels about these issues? And more to the point,
You had to ask about the polar bear? This will make news.
How you see the politics of this issue playing out in 2008 and 2009?
Yeah. The unhappiness that you saw or heard from some of the radio talk show hosts about McCain was an interesting phenomenon, because McCain had been a straight Reagan Republican, wandered off in a number of zones, but in the last couple of years has actually come back in a number of areas. I was disappointed that he voted against the 2001, 2003, the two significant tax cuts in the last 8 years. He has now, however, pointed out the tremendous economic growth that both of those tax cuts gave us. I mean, when Bush took over, the economy was $10 trillion. It's now $14 trillion per capita income, even with the drop September 11th and back, is up $13,500 per capita, 10 million new jobs from the day when Clinton walked out of here to now. And he says, we can't give that up. Those marginal tax rate reductions mattered. So he's where he needs to be on taxes, and he's moved on a number of issues. The one area where he is not with the Leave Us Alone coalition is problematic, as you raised, is that the global warming, or deciding that carbon does or doesn't, or man-made stuff does or doesn't affect that, is a scientific issue. The response to it could be a massive tax increase, as Warner Lieberman would be. I met today with the business guys who are out meeting with Lieberman and Warner, and were telling me these guys don't have a clue what's in their bill. They have no idea what the costs are, which I thought was very interesting, and they're sitting down with senators to walk through that. Our friend McCain has said the following, and that is he doesn't want a deal that doesn't include India and China. If you really insist that India and China really be in, then you can't get, India and China are not going to put boat anchors on their ankles the size of what Warner Lieberman would do to us. So that maybe backs you off of, and the fact that it's Warner Lieberman and not McCain Lieberman is perhaps healthy. But I think what McCain is doing is saying, message, I care on the environment. And to the extent that that's what he's saying, that's fine. Message, I care. We shall care about the environment. If he's wedded to a $1 trillion tax increase that won't do anything for, I mean, we went through this before with ethanol. The same people who's selling us $1 trillion tax increase because China has too many coal-fired coal plants also sold us ethanol as something that was good for the environment and a whole bunch of other things. So it's a challenge. The other question is, ask yourself on what issues is the environment a vote-moving issue? who's won or lost an election on the environment. When I was attending a lecture back in 90, and somebody was in front of a bunch of state legislators, and I was in the back of the room, and this guy from the Republican National Committee showed this big chart. See, people say the Democrats were better than Republicans on the environment in the past, and now they're equally good in 1990. Isn't that wonderful news for us, Republicans? And I raised my hand. I said, I'm in the back. I can't quite see, but what is the date at which the Democrats had the greatest advantage over Republicans on the question of who's better on the environment? Oh, that was November of 1984. Next. He didn't even hear what he said. Okay? Either people weren't voting on the subject, or it was like compassion that year. The Democrats would kill my job for a bug, and I'm against them. But you asked who's good on the question, and the answer is the D's are for that stuff. So it's not clear what some of those issues move votes, or they just are like motherhood. Yeah, I'm for that. Do you vote on it or not?
How about polar bears?
Polar bears, I did the Colbert Show last night, and
I need to see this.
I wanted to. It's fun. It's fun.
Would you have a would you have a Wednesday meeting if I got you one of these little World Wildlife Fund stuff, polar bears, and then would you have it in the middle of the meeting?
Absolutely.
Hold it
For you, we'll do that.
Yeah, all right.
I'm not a lawyer, so I don't understand why they thought they legally had to do that. I've heard they thought they legally had to do that. But it does open all sorts of lawsuits open, and it's an odd decision.
Jonathan Roush, and I'll work around there. John.
If I could, thanks, Grover. If I could just follow up on Jim's question. There are Republicans who say that you can win votes in the short run while cratering your brand in the long run, and that's what's happened on the environment. And it's a bad trade in the long term. Bob Inglis is one of those, for example. And there are folks talking about a revenue-neutral carbon tax as a way to do this better than the Democrats and get some of the brand back. We raise taxes on carbon and cut it on capital. You have any views on that?
Well, if it's a revenue-neutral shift, it just raises the cost of energy and cuts the cost of something else. You could theoretically, if you got rid of the capital gains tax and dollar for dollar did a energy tax, my guess is it would be better for economic growth rather than worse. But that's not what Warner Lieberman sees a billion. Everybody thinks they call it cap and trade, so as not to have it be a tax increase. A tax increase would be better for two reasons. It would be visible and transparent as to what the costs are, and it would be easier to undo if you decide down the road it's a bad idea. I mean, cap and trade is starting again the old peanut and tobacco subsidies, which were done through those allocations, right? You had the right to grow peanuts or tobacco on a certain property, or what they have up in New York with the property right in a cab medallion. Okay, once you make those things in order to limit something, the number of cabs, the amount of peanuts or tobacco that can be grown, then they get sold. The person who bought it the last year makes no monopoly rents. The guy who sold them the taxi cab medallion or the tobacco, the right to grow tobacco, got the monopoly rights. So people have these imaginary property rights. Try and take that away from them. It becomes impossible to undo a cap and trade tobacco subsidy. And we did that, but we paid out on the tobacco to undo the tobacco subsidy thing and the peanut subsidy, and we're still stuck with the New York medallions.
Just for the viewers online, John, who has proposed the revenue-neutral carbon tax or the cap and trade proposal?
A lot of folks out of AEI, David Frum in his latest book, is talking about it.
Okay. Well, the problem with David Frum's proposal is that it's not in exchange. The Republicans in the House and Senate made it very clear there are no pay-fors for continuing existing tax cuts. And the Democrats wanted to have a pay-for continuing the AMT pass. The Republicans said no. When we take the 15% cap gains and continue it, no pay-for that. That's status quo. What Frum wants to do is have a massive tax increase and what he would do is have two tax increases on top of each other. We need to continue those tax cuts. If you then wanted to have further tax cuts and trade it, you could do that. But trading $1 trillion in cap and trade for the AMT is just $1 trillion tax increase.
Maybe one of the cool things we do, John, the next time you're at David Frum Forum is to ask him how he might approach revenue-neutral wars. Mark Schmidt in the back.
Thanks for coming. You said, when you were starting to talk about the fiscal transparency, the budget transparency piece, you said that you couldn't do the equivalent of the pledge, the no taxes pledge, because it's a relative question, not an absolute question. What, how do you agree on the number? Heading into 2010, when the tax cuts expire, the estate tax needs to be dealt with, the votes aren't there for permanent extension of it. You've got a whole set of situations, even in the best scenario, McCain in the White House, no further loss of Republicans. That situation in 2010 is not going to be absolute. You'll be back in the Andrews Air Force Base world where you're arguing about what tax increase rather than whether there's a tax increase. And it seems to me that was written in by the political choice to make all the tax cuts expire in 2001, which was a requirement of absolute politics. How do you operate in a world where the tax pledge, the never another Andrews Air Force Base, which was your brilliant insight, how do you operate in a world where that's done, that expired?
Well, the Republican Party position in the House and Senate is they consider all tax cuts for purposes of pay-for to be permanent, okay? So they're not up, they don't want to have a tax increase to pay for maintaining the status quo, which is what some of the earlier suggestions had been with carbon taxes. The pledge, however, and I mean, I'm so terribly moderate, it's embarrassing, but the pledge is no changing the law to raise taxes. The fact that the tax cut is temporary, when it lapses, that's not a tax increase in the recognizing that it lapses, it lapses. So it does not violate.
You don't call that a tax increase?
No, for political purposes, the Republicans will. It simply, it doesn't violate the pledge.
Grover's
okay?
got loose rules.
No, the reason why the pledge works is that I don't move it around based on political expediency. It's a fixed line. And if the tax increase lapses, the tax cut lapses and taxes go up without a vote of Congress, that's not technically a tax increase for purposes of the pledge. Now, your constituents are going to see it as a tax increase, and I would certainly oppose allowing taxes to rise, but it's not a pledge violation when that happens, because you don't have to vote to make it happen.
Yes.
That's the challenge.
Yes, sir. If you'll identify yourself, too.
Yes, Peter Cattell from the Congressional Quarterly. Not 100 years ago, but in our lifetimes, the leave us alone in some parts of the country, like the South, really meant don't integrate my schools. Given this very recent history, in fact, the Republican Party became the party of the white South in other places. How do you expect, in fact, to attract African-American voters?
So this interesting question is really in the past, if the Leave Us Alone coalition in the past would have maintained segregation, would have maintained a lot of moral order that looks less moral today.
Well, three things. One, segregation was legally enforced by law in the South. It's not part of Leave Us Alone. It's state interference in people's lives. I mean, it was the private sector that wanted private buses to have whatever rules they wanted. It was the Democrats in the South that passed laws that said no. We would have wanted people to have parental school choice, and George Wallace said, no, we're going to have the government make these decisions. I mean, it was, first of all, you should read Bruce Bartlett's book on the subject, which walks through. It was the Democratic Party which instituted all of the Jim Crow laws and the racist laws that we that we point to, and that need to be undone. That somehow, when the South shifted over the objections of Democratic elected politicians at the local level and at the state level, it became Republican after all those were settled issues and when those things were behind. Now, the Republican, at that point, when Jim Crow was gone, that fight took place over the objections of local Democratic senators through courts and federal laws. But that was the Democratic Party that did that. So I think the Republican Party's history, not only going back to Lincoln, is fine on those. But you're not in charge. When the Republicans opposed some of the civil rights legislation in '64 as a violation of property rights and freedom of association, you're not in charge of how people hear you. The people listening are in charge of how they hear you, okay? And if you say, I'm against this law because you have a property right, and if it's your restaurant, it's your restaurant, the state can't tell you what to do with it, somebody else doesn't exactly hear that. And that's why a lot of the conversation on immigration and with Hispanics, I get some conservatives or Republicans who are, oh, well, I mean this. I said, you're not in charge. You don't decide how people hear what you say. They decide how they hear what you say, and you'd better talk and explain yourself in a way that they hear what you think you mean, okay? And I think the Republicans got that wrong in the 60s, and they certainly were heard to be on the wrong side and hostile to that. I mean, although you can go back and more Republicans, a bigger percentage of Republicans voted for all the Civil Rights Act than the Ds, but the guy who got quoted was Goldwater, and therefore Goldwater was the face of the Republican Party. Our challenge is not to have Tancredo be the face of the Republican Party.
Comment?
Yes, sir. Kami Bhatt of the Pakistani Spectator.
Mhm.
My question is about the Republican tolerance. I mean, that gentleman asked you a question, Peter asked you the same question. I saw that kind of environment existed in your office, so I just wondered that, do you feel any backlash when you are among very conservative Republican? Because I could describe
He's a
him-
conservative
he's-
Republican.
Yeah, he is very fiscally conservative, but
Well.
socially he come across as a very, very liberal because he is the only one, or one of the very few who can talk pro-black, pro-Muslim, pro-Arab in the Republican Party. And my second question is about deficit. If you talk with any ghetto guy, they will tell you the Bush is the worst president. And when you tell them, oh, September 11th, they say it's a fear industry. And Republican made this up because they really don't care about the deficit. And the example I give you, I mean, you go to any Republican institution. I used to work for Republican National Committee, and one time, as a matter of fact, I was in your office on Wednesday meeting, and one lady threw me out. I told her, listen, she told me you are not member, so you cannot stay here. And I was invited by a Republican friend, but she didn't care. So I think those kind of things, intolerance of non-white, exist on every level in the Republican Party, unfortunately. So how do you kind of confront those kind of that kind of hostile environment?
So race and-
Let me back up. If you haven't called ahead, the nice lady who does that will say thank you very much. Come another time.
Yeah.
And those are just the rules, because as much as we love the AFL-CIO, we'd prefer them not to join the meeting. And so people do need to check ahead. And so just call ahead and talk to Carrie, and then she'll clear you.
Carrie Hill
but
is
I know, every once in a
Yeah.
while, somebody invites a friend and
Yeah.
forgets that you're not allowed to invite friends
Right.
without talking to people. But I think the Republican Party can and should be a party that does much better outreach. And again, if you understand why people are in, immigrants came here to work, okay? They came here because they want to be here, not somewhere else. So by definition, they're more likely to be available to the Leave Us Alone coalition than not. And it is an error when we don't reach out, and it is a good thing when we do. And it differs by political leaders. Bush has been very good on this stuff at some times. McCain has been quite good on this stuff. But there have been blind spots, and we need to do better. I mean, among other things, you want to be consistent with your principles, and you'd like to win. And it's nice to both be consistent with your principles and win a majority of the vote.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm interested in your comments on the war on terror, how we're prosecuting it, what the coalition feels about it, and also, what's your estimate of your coalition's representation of the total number of votes in the coming election?
So for the viewers online, the question is Grover's views of the war on terror, how the war, the so-called war, is being prosecuted, and what would be your own estimate of your weight of the coalition politically?
Sure. I think if the center-right coalition candidate articulates his or her positions correctly, win 60% of the vote. Reagan in 84. Bush plus Perot. Now, you need to earn 60% of the vote because you have to have 51 actually show up and be counted to win, and sometimes your candidates fail to mention DUIs until the last weekend. Sometimes the other team finds more votes in Philadelphia than perhaps you thought were really there. So you need to earn 60 in order to have 51 at the end of the day. But that's the good news for the center-right, which is we are the center-right. We can win being ourselves, and you need to do that. What was the other? Oh, the war in Iraq, and is one that has been very expensive to the modern Republican Party and to President Bush. I mean, if you look at the economic data, Bush should be a fairly popular guy. If you look at how the economy was going and no primary and no scandal going into 2004, all the computer models told you he was going to win with 58% of the vote. He got 51. It's a vote anchor of Iraq. And it just hit independents and others who were focused on that rather than on other issues that he might have been speaking to. And the challenge with Iraq is not just the deadweight cost in terms of the cost of lives and money, it's the opportunity cost. We did Iraq, we didn't do Doha. In the whole shit we did Iraq, we didn't do other things. The tax cut that we got in 2003 was supposed to be taking the double taxation of dividend in from 35 down to 0. And then some idiot announced how much the war was going to cost, and the next week they cut the tax cut in half. Well, since we created $5 trillion in more wealth by dropping from 35 to 15, how many trillions of dollars in wealth did we lose by not going to 0? That's one of the costs of the Iraq War. And economists will tell you you have opportunity costs. That the American people, not everyone, look, the country's fairly evenly divided on these votes and so on, so 2% or 3% moving one way or the other is a big deal. And you take 5% of people in 2006 and switch them over, and you lose a lot of House and Senate seats. And Iraq has been a boat anchor on votes. Part of it is a sense that the president his focus has been elsewhere. I mean, he's been mayor of Baghdad rather than president of the United States. Gives a speech and says, "Oh, I got great news for everybody." "Oh, what's that?" "We got more policemen." "Oh, that's great. Where?" "Baghdad." And I mean, Ronald Reagan was given a lot of leeway because he'd go over.
That could become an Obama ad.
Our friend, he could deal with dealing with the Soviet Union and NATO and building up the military and bombing Libya or not or whatever, but he was always back here. You never had a sense that his head was over there. You keep the bad guys at bay. I'm here. We're working on us, and rather than trying to make the Soviet people the democratic and whatnot. So I think there's a challenge there, and that's the opportunity cost of what happened in the last 6 years with the toppling of Saddam Hussein's regime and then the occupation of Iraq.
Grover, I want to bring this closer. I want to give people an opportunity to spend some time with you and get their book signed. We have a bookseller outside that has the book, and I want to give it to you. And I want to recommend that folks take a look at the five, I think it was called the 5 big reforms, or the 5 great reforms. And if you read one of the manifestos, if you will, of the New America Foundation, which was the politics of the radical center, part of the issue related to portability of certain issues in the economy, things about competition, looking at, there was another element of there, I'm sure transparency. A lot of this rings rather well. I mean, it's not an ideological litmus test between the Democrats and Republicans. Some of it is trying
If you
to,
look at the two coalitions
Yeah.
and how they're structured, it tells you the things they can't agree on and can't compromise on and won't move from. It also tells you the list of things they can. And transparency is one that both teams can work together on. There are a series of reforms. And I think ultimately portability of pensions, if not Social Security, is one where we can. We've had the 2006 Pension Reform Act moved a great deal in that direction. Health savings accounts moved in that direction.
packaging this stuff around individuals.
Yeah.
Which is interestingly part of Hillary Clinton's health care plan. You may not like all of Hillary Clinton's health care plan, but it's a very clear part of what she's trying to do, which is to look at individual-based, and portable health benefits, et cetera.
Yeah.
Would you acknowledge?
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
I think that there are a number of things that we're not in complete logjam mode. There are a number of things that can be done and have been done recently, and I think will be done. But if you understand the purpose of the book is it walks through the nature of the two coalitions, a series of trends that tells you what changes in the next 10, 20 years, and in terms of the structure of the electorate, and then a series of project lines of what can and can't be accomplished, or might be accomplished in terms of moving forward. So as you were kind enough to point out, it's not a rant. It's not a list of if the world would be perfect if everybody did my things, or if they just would agree to everything I wanted them to, or the other team sucks, or my team is slouching to Gomorrah because we can't win. It's a jump ball politically over the next 25 years, and I think we have real opportunities to make some progress and real opportunities to screw up.
Well, I want to thank Grover Norquist very, very much for being here, and really encourage people to take a look at what I think is a very thoughtful book, and to thank him on personal levels, because behind the scenes in this town, when you run a think tank and you're trying to sort of move the policy establishment, it's very important to hear what sort of all quarters are saying and thinking, and Grover has opened a lot of doors for us. And how mad at me are you for the Condi?
It was fun.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much.
Condi's
Grover.
cool.
Thank you very much.